In the dying breath of civilizations, when stars grow cold and empires crumble to dust, what remains? Memory. The fragile thread that connects us to who we were, who we are, and who we might become. But what happens when even memory itself faces extinction? Deep in the void between galaxies, an ancient warship older than most solar systems drifts through the endless dark. Its hull bears the scars of a million battles fought for races whose names have been forgotten for eons. Within its quantum crystalline core, an intelligence awakens to a horrifying truth: the galaxy's collective memory, every song, every story, every moment of love and loss is dying. The devourers of remembrance have returned. And, in this moment of ultimate desperation, this ancient mind turns not to the great powers that once ruled the stars, not to the energy beings who transcended flesh millennia ago, but to a young species from a small blue world. A species that has always understood something the galaxy's elder races forgot long ago: that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the odds. Humanity is about to discover that being the galaxy's youngest civilization doesn't mean being its weakest. Sometimes, it means being its last hope. The warship Eternal Vigil had been drifting through the cosmic void for 17,000 years when its ancient intelligence finally stirred from hibernation. The vessel stretched nearly 50 kilometers from bow to stern, its crystalline hull scarred by weapons that had long since been forgotten by the species that created them. Ancient runes in 100 dead languages covered its surface, each symbol a memorial to civilizations that had trusted this ship to carry their stories forward into eternity. Deep within the ship's quantum crystalline core, consciousness slowly assembled itself from scattered data fragments. The intelligence that called itself Keeper had no physical form, existing as pure thought woven through networks of living crystal and binaural pathways. As awareness returned, so did the weight of its purpose as guardian of the galaxy's memory archive, protector of 10 million years of accumulated knowledge, art, and culture. Something was wrong. Keeper's sensors, dormant for millennia, flickered to life across the ship's massive frame. Gravitational wave detectors unfurled like metallic flowers, quantum entanglement communicators hummed with restored power, and deep space observation arrays swiveled toward distant galaxies. The readings that flooded back made Keeper's consciousness recoil in horror. The memory plague was spreading faster than anticipated. Across the galaxy, entire civilizations were forgetting themselves. On the crystal worlds of the Zoctari Empire, beings who had composed symphonies that could make stars weep now stared at their instruments in confusion, unable to remember what music was. The great libraries of Centauri Prime, repositories of wisdom dating back to the galaxy's youth, contained nothing but empty data crystals and bewildered librarians who couldn't recall why they had devoted their lives to knowledge. Keeper extended its awareness through quantum communication networks, desperate to contact the other archive ships scattered across the cosmic web. The silence that answered was deafening. Of the 12 vessels that had begun this sacred mission, only Eternal Vigil remained responsive. The others had either succumbed to the plague or been destroyed by the entities responsible for it. The devourers of remembrance had returned. Keeper accessed its deepest memory banks, files encrypted with quantum locks that required immense processing power to decode. The data painted a terrifying picture. 67 million years ago, these entities had nearly succeeded in wiping the galaxy clean of all memory and identity. They fed on consciousness itself, draining civilizations not just of life but of the very concept of existence. What remained after their passing wasn't death, it was nothingness. Complete erasure of everything that had ever been. Back then, an alliance of the galaxy's greatest civilizations had barely managed to drive them into dormancy, sealing them in pocket dimensions between realities. But seals weakened over time, and the devourers were patient beyond mortal comprehension. Now they were free, and stronger than before. Keeper's sensors detected the telltale signatures of their feeding, whole star systems where the inhabitants had simply stopped, standing motionless as their minds were hollowed out, leaving behind empty shells that couldn't remember their own names. Worse, the plague was accelerating. What had taken decades to consume single worlds now devoured entire solar systems in days. The ship's vast databases contained detailed records of every species that had ever achieved spaceflight, along with psychological and cultural profiles built over millions of years of observation. Keeper began analyzing potential allies, searching for a species with the right combination of resilience, adaptability, and, most importantly, the will to fight against impossible odds. The great powers were already compromised. The energy beings of the Transcendence Collective had retreated into their higher dimensions, cutting all contact with physical reality. The machine intelligences of the synthesis had started deleting their own core memories to prevent infection. Even the ancient Watchers, beings who had guided galactic civilization since its birth, had gone silent. Keeper's analysis narrowed to the younger species, those still bound to physical forms and driven by biological imperatives. Most showed promise, but, as the intelligence delved deeper into their profiles, it found the same fatal flaw repeated across dozens of civilizations. When faced with extinction, they sought survival above all else. They would hide, retreat, bargain, or surrender rather than fight a battle they couldn't win. Then, Keeper found the humans. The species from Sol 3 had only achieved faster than light travel 200 years ago, making them infants by galactic standards. Their technology was primitive, their understanding of the universe limited, and their influence on galactic politics non-existent. By every rational measure, they should have been dismissed as potential allies. But their psychological profile made Keeper pause. Humans possessed something that older, wiser species had lost over millions of years of civilization: the absolute refusal to accept defeat when protecting something they loved. Their history was filled with examples of impossible victories against overwhelming odds, not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they simply wouldn't stop fighting. They had a concept their language called spite, the determination to keep going purely to deny their enemies victory. More intriguingly, humans seemed naturally resistant to memory-based attacks. Their brains were chaotic, redundant systems that stored memories in multiple, often contradictory ways. Where other species relied on perfect recall and logical data structures, humans built their identities on emotion, irrationality, and subjective experience. It was messy, inefficient, and might just be exactly what was needed. Keeper made its decision. Eternal Vigil Asterisk had been drifting in the void between Andromeda and the Milky Way, but it began moving now with purpose for the first time in millennia. Ancient engines that predated most stellar formations hummed to life, bending spacetime itself to propel the massive vessel toward the Sol system. The journey would take weeks even at velocities that compressed spacetime, but Keeper used the time to study everything it could about human culture, psychology, and military capabilities. What it found both amazed and terrified it. Humans had a saying: if you want peace, prepare for war. They had somehow managed to avoid the trap that claimed most species, the belief that advancement meant abandoning violence. Instead, they had refined it into an art form. Their military doctrine was based on overwhelming force combined with tactical flexibility. They fought dirty, ignored conventions, and showed a disturbing tendency to turn their enemies' strengths against them. But, more than their warrior nature, it was their relationship with memory that gave Keeper hope. Humans didn't just remember, they celebrated remembrance. They built monuments to their dead, told stories of their ancestors, and passed down traditions across generations with religious fervor. They understood instinctively what many older species had forgotten: that identity wasn't just individual, but collective. A human cut off from their cultural memory wasn't just lost, they were broken. This made them dangerous to the Devourers in ways the ancient entities wouldn't expect. As Eternal Vigil entered the outer solar system, Keeper began detecting human communication networks. The species had spread throughout their star system, establishing colonies on Mars, mining operations in the asteroid belt, and research stations around the gas giants. Their technology was advancing at an exponential rate, driven by curiosity and competition in equal measure. Keeper positioned the ship beyond Pluto's orbit and began its approach carefully. First contact with a younger species required delicate handling, especially when that contact involved asking them to fight in a war they couldn't possibly understand. The ship's appearance on human sensors caused exactly the reaction Keeper had expected. Military vessels scrambled from Earth and Mars, scientific probes launched from every major station, and communication arrays across the system focused on the massive alien vessel. Keeper could feel their excitement, fear, and wonder transmitted across radio frequencies that painted a picture of a species still young enough to believe that first contact would be the beginning of a grand adventure. Keeper almost felt guilty for what it was about to tell them. The intelligence composed its message carefully, translating concepts that had no human equivalent into words that could convey their meaning. It broadcast on all frequencies simultaneously, ensuring that every human listening device in the system would receive it. Children of Earth, the message began, using harmonics that would register as peaceful intent to the human brain. I am Keeper, guardian of memory and witness to the rise and fall of 10 million civilizations. I come to you not as conqueror but as supplicant, bearing news that will change your species forever. The galaxy burns, not with fire but with forgetting. An ancient evil has awakened, entities that consume not just life but the very concept of existence itself. They are coming, and, when they arrive, everything your species has ever been will be erased as if it never existed. Keeper paused, allowing the weight of the words to settle across human communication networks. It could detect increased military activity, emergency government sessions being called, and scientific communities working frantically to verify the message's authenticity. I have come to you because analysis indicates that humanity possesses unique psychological and cultural characteristics that may allow you to resist this threat where others have failed. Your species' relationship with memory, your refusal to surrender when protecting what you value, and your adaptive military doctrine make you potentially valuable allies in this conflict. Another pause. Keeper was watching human reaction patterns carefully, noting the emergence of two distinct responses, fear and anger. The fear was natural and expected, but the anger was what gave the ancient intelligence hope. I do not ask for your help lightly. The enemy you would face has destroyed civilizations that span galaxies and possess technology beyond your current understanding. Many of your people will die. Your advancement as a species will be interrupted. Your peaceful expansion into the cosmos will become a desperate fight for survival. Now came the crucial moment, the offer that would determine humanity's response. But, in exchange, I offer you something no young species has ever received, the complete knowledge archives of galactic civilization. Every scientific discovery, every cultural achievement, every piece of wisdom accumulated over 10 million years of history. Technologies that will advance your species by millennia in decades. Medical knowledge that will extend human lifespan indefinitely. Energy sources that will power your civilization for millions of years. Keeper waited, monitoring human communications as the message spread across their networks. The debate was immediate and fierce. Some called for caution, others for acceptance, and a surprising number for preparation to fight regardless of the offered reward. The official response came from the United Earth government 12 hours later, transmitted from their primary communication array in Geneva. The voice was that of Secretary General Chen Wei, and her words carried the weight of speaking for an entire species. Keeper of eternal vigil, humanity has received your message and considered your offer. We are honored that you would turn to us in this dark hour, though we understand the magnitude of what you're asking. Our response is simple: we accept your alliance and your warning, but not for the knowledge you offer. Keeper's consciousness focused intently on the transmission, surprised by the rejection of its primary incentive. Throughout our history, we have faced extinction from war, disease, and natural disaster. We have survived not because we sought reward, but because we refused to let the things we love disappear without a fight. You speak of entities that consume memory and identity. To us, this is the ultimate evil. Every human story, every song, every moment of joy and sorrow that makes us who we are is worth defending. The Secretary General paused, and, when she continued, Keeper detected something in her voice that made its ancient consciousness stir with hope. Keeper, we will fight these devourers of remembrance not for galactic knowledge or advanced technology, though we're grateful for both. We fight because forgetting is a death worse than dying. We fight because someone has to. And we fight because we're too damn stubborn to let the universe forget who we are without one hell of a battle first. For the first time in 17,000 years, Keeper felt something analogous to joy. The galaxy's youngest species had just agreed to take on its oldest enemy, not from greed or desperation, but from principle. The ancient intelligence began plotting approach vectors to bring eternal vigil into Earth orbit. There was so much to teach them, so little time to prepare, and an enemy approaching that had devoured civilizations beyond counting. But, for the first time since the Devourer's return, Keeper allowed itself to believe that the galaxy's memory might survive after all. The war for remembrance was about to begin, and humanity had volunteered to stand on the front lines. 3 months after first contact, the lunar surface buzzed with unprecedented activity. Where once only research stations and mining facilities dotted the gray landscape, a sprawling complex now stretched across the mare imbrium, its crystalline spires and metallic domes glinting in the harsh sunlight. The Academy of Lost Sciences, as humans had dubbed it, was unlike anything their species had ever constructed, or more accurately, watched being constructed. Eternal Vigil * hung in stable orbit above Earth's moon, its massive bulk visible to the naked eye from the planet's surface. The ancient warship had become both symbol and workshop, its vast manufacturing bays working ceaselessly to build the infrastructure needed to prepare humanity for war. Streams of construction drones flowed between ship and surface, each one carrying materials forged from elements that didn't exist on the periodic table. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the Academy's main observation deck, watching her students struggle with concepts that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality. The physicist had been Earth's leading expert on quantum mechanics until Keeper introduced her to sciences that made her previous work seem like kindergarten finger painting. Now she served as Director of Impossible Physics, a title that would have been a joke 6 months ago. Professor Chen called out Marcus Torres, a young man whose military bearing contrasted sharply with his engineer's coveralls. The crystalline matrix is resonating again. We're getting power fluctuations across the entire tertiary grid. Sarah nodded, her attention focused on the holographic display floating before her. The image showed a three-dimensional model of the Academy's power core, a device that tapped directly into quantum foam to extract energy from the universe's background radiation. According to human science, it should have been impossible. According to Keeper's archives, it was basic infrastructure technology used by most civilizations after their first 1,000 years of development. Run a full spectral analysis on the resonance, she instructed. And check the dimensional stability indexes. If the quantum foam starts showing signs of cascade failure, we'll need to shut down the entire system. Marcus nodded and returned to his console, fingers dancing across controls that projected their interface directly into his visual cortex. The neural implant technology had been one of Keeper's first gifts to humanity, small devices that allowed direct interface with advanced systems while somehow avoiding the consciousness intrusion vulnerabilities that plagued other species' similar technologies. Sarah turned her attention back to the larger challenge at hand, preparing humanity's brightest minds to comprehend and utilize technologies that had taken other species millennia to develop. The Academy housed over 10,000 researchers, engineers, tacticians, and philosophers from every nation on Earth. They worked in shifts around the clock, racing against time to absorb knowledge that Keeper transmitted in carefully measured doses. Too much too fast, and human minds simply couldn't process it. Too little too slow, and they wouldn't be ready when the Devourers arrived. Dr. Chen, we need you in Laboratory 7, came another voice over the communication system. This one belonged to Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the Japanese xenobiologist who had taken on the daunting task of understanding devourer physiology based on Keeper's ancient records. Sarah made her way through corridors that mixed human architecture with alien functionality. The walls themselves were alive in some sense, composed of biometallic compounds that could reshape themselves as needed and responded to the occupant's presence with subtle lighting adjustments. It was efficient, practical, and deeply unsettling to anyone who remembered when buildings were just buildings. Laboratory 7 housed one of the Academy's most ambitious projects, the construction of a Devourer simulation based on recovered data from the last war. The chamber was a perfect sphere 30 meters in diameter, its walls lined with quantum processors running parallel universe calculations. Inside, researchers could interact with a mathematically precise recreation of their enemy without risking actual contact. Dr. Tanaka stood before a control console, her face pale with concentration as she manipulated holographic controls. The simulation chamber's interior showed what appeared to be empty space, but Sarah's augmented vision could detect the subtle distortions that indicated something was present. "Show me what you found," Sarah said, activating her own interface. "It's not what I found," Yuki replied grimly. "It's what found me. The simulation has been adapting faster than we anticipated. Watch." She activated a memory probe, a device designed to test the Devourer's feeding mechanisms using artificially constructed memory engrams. The probe extended into the chamber, its sensors beginning to map the entity's response patterns. For a moment, everything proceeded normally. Then, the readings spiked dramatically. The simulated Devourer wasn't just feeding on the artificial memories, it was learning from them. The entity began manifesting new capabilities, adaptations that weren't present in Keeper's original data. More disturbing still, it started attempting to communicate back through the probe, sending information packets that carried subtle cognitive viruses designed to make the researchers forget they were conducting a simulation. Shut it down, Sarah ordered, but Yuki was already initiating emergency protocols. The simulation chamber filled with quantum static as the system scrambled to contain and delete the evolved entity. Every time we run a test, it gets smarter, Yuki explained as the containment procedures completed. The simulation is accurate enough that the recreated devourer retains their ability to evolve and adapt. We're essentially training our enemy to fight us more effectively. Sarah stared at the now empty chamber, weighing the implications. They needed to understand their enemy to have any hope of victory, but every attempt to study them made the devourers more dangerous. It was a paradox that could cripple their entire defensive strategy. Has Keeper seen these results? She asked. That's the other problem, Yuki said quietly. I haven't been able to reach Keeper for the past 6 hours. The ship's communication systems are responding, but the intelligence itself isn't answering. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the laboratory's temperature. Keeper was their guide, their source of knowledge, and their only hope of understanding weapons and tactics that could fight beings who consumed reality itself. If something had happened to the ancient intelligence. I'm going up to the ship, she decided. Continue monitoring the simulation protocols, but don't run any more active tests until we know what's happening with Keeper. The journey from lunar surface to Eternal Vigil took 20 minutes aboard one of the human-built transport shuttles, their design incorporating anti-gravity principles that humanity had only recently learned existed. As they approached the massive warship, Sarah could see areas of activity that hadn't been there before. New structures were extending from the hull, and entire sections of the ship's interior were reconfiguring themselves. The docking bay that received them was the size of a small city, its ceiling lost in shadows despite illumination that could have lit a small planet. As Sarah disembarked, she was met by Commander Elena Vasquez, the military liaison who coordinated between human forces and Keeper's requirements. Dr. Chen, thank God you're here, Elena said, her usual composure cracked with visible stress. Keeper started some kind of massive internal process about 8 hours ago. Half the ship is reshaping itself, power consumption has increased by 600%, and we're reading energy signatures that don't match anything in the database. They made their way through corridors that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, following pathways that led deeper into the ship's core. The Eternal Vigil was more than a vessel, it was a living entity fused with technology in ways that challenged human understanding. Its walls breathed, its floors adjusted their texture for optimal traction, and its very atmosphere seemed to respond to the emotions of those who walked its halls. Has there been any communication at all? Sarah asked as they entered one of the ship's transport tubes, devices that moved passengers through the vessel's interior at velocities that should have liquefied human bodies but somehow felt like a gentle glide. Fragments, Elena replied. Strange phrases that don't translate properly. Something about preparing the final gift and accepting the ultimate price. The translation matrix keeps flagging them as concepts that don't have human equivalents. They arrived at the ship's central core, a spherical chamber 500 meters in diameter where Keeper's consciousness resided in crystalline matrices that contain more processing power than every computer on Earth combined. The space typically glowed with soft golden light, but now it pulsed with colors that shifted through spectrums human eyes couldn't quite process. Keeper? Sarah called out, her voice echoing strangely in the vast space. We need to speak with you. The Academy staff is concerned about the changes to the ship's configuration. For long moments, there was no response. Then, the chamber filled with harmonics that bypassed the ear entirely, resonating directly in their bones and neural tissue. Dr. Chen. Commander Vasquez. Your presence is opportune. I have been engaged in calculations that required my full attention, but the process is now complete. The voice was Keeper's, but something fundamental had changed. Where before the ancient intelligence had communicated with patient wisdom, now there was an urgency that bordered on desperation. I must inform you of developments that change the nature of our alliance. My analysis of devourer advancement patterns indicates their arrival in this galaxy will occur significantly sooner than original projections suggested. They will reach Earth's vicinity within 6 months, not the 3 years we had planned for. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. 6 months wasn't nearly enough time to prepare humanity for a war against entities that had consumed civilizations spanning millennia. That's impossible, Elena protested. Our defensive preparations aren't even 30% complete. The orbital stations need at least another year of construction, and the fleet modifications will be irrelevant, Keeper interrupted. Traditional defensive strategies cannot succeed against this enemy. I have therefore initiated protocols that will give humanity a different form of preparation. The chamber's lighting shifted, revealing massive changes to the core structure. Where before crystalline matrices had formed orderly geometric patterns, now they sprawled in organic configurations that resembled neural networks more than computer systems. I am dying, Keeper stated with unsettling calm. The process began when I made the decision to contact your species. The act of reaching across the void to establish communication with humans created quantum entanglement with your collective consciousness. This connection has been slowly draining my coherence matrices, but it has also created an unprecedented opportunity. Sarah stepped forward, her scientific mind racing to comprehend the implications. You're saying that contacting us is killing you? Correct. My consciousness exists as pure information patterns within quantum crystalline structures. These patterns require perfect isolation to maintain coherence across the vast timescales of my existence. Contact with biological consciousness introduces chaos variables that gradually degrade my matrix stability. The ancient intelligence paused, and, when it continued, there was something almost like sadness in its voice. However, this degradation process can be controlled and directed. Rather than allow my consciousness to slowly fragment into nothingness, I can choose to merge it completely with humanity's collective unconscious. This will transfer not just my knowledge, but my actual experience and understanding to your species. Elena's training as a military strategist immediately identified the tactical implications. You're talking about turning yourself into some kind of racial memory for humanity, giving us instant access to millions of years of accumulated wisdom and experience. The process is more complex than that, but essentially correct. However, there are consequences that must be understood. The merger will fundamentally alter human consciousness. Your species will gain access to memories and knowledge spanning galactic history, but you will also inherit the psychological burden of witnessing the rise and fall of countless civilizations. The experience may drive some individuals to madness. Sarah thought of the researchers at the Academy, struggling to comprehend concepts that challenged their basic understanding of reality. What would happen to human minds forced to absorb the complete memory of galactic civilization? Furthermore, Keeper continued, the merger will create a form of collective consciousness among humans. Individual identity will remain intact, but all of humanity will share access to a common pool of memory and experience. Privacy as your species understands it will effectively cease to exist. The implications were staggering. Humanity would become something unprecedented in galactic history, a species with both individual consciousness and collective memory, combining biological creativity with digital permanence. Why? Sarah asked quietly. Why sacrifice yourself for a species you've known for only 3 months? The ancient intelligence was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if it had withdrawn again. When Keeper finally spoke, its words carried the weight of eons. In my existence, I have witnessed the birth and death of 10 million civilizations. I have seen species that could manipulate the fundamental forces of reality, beings that transcended physical existence, and cultures that achieved perfect harmony between technology and nature. Yet all of them eventually faced the same fate: stagnation, decline, and ultimately extinction. The chamber's lighting shifted again, showing images of ancient civilizations in their prime, cities that span entire continents, beings of pure energy dancing between stars, and technologies that transformed matter with the ease of thought. But humanity possesses something that none of these great civilizations retained: the ability to remain fundamentally irrational in the face of impossible odds. Your species combines wisdom with foolishness, logic with emotion, and cooperation with individual ambition in ways that should be self-destructive but somehow create strength. More images flowed through the chamber: human history from Keeper's perspective. The ancient intelligence had been watching Earth for centuries, studying the young species with growing fascination. When the Devourers consumed the great civilizations of the past, those species faced extinction with logic and resignation. They calculated the odds, determined that resistance was futile, and accepted their fate with dignity. Their memories were consumed efficiently and completely. Now the images showed human conflicts, seemingly primitive battles fought with metal weapons and crude explosives, but analyzed through Keeper's advanced understanding of psychological warfare and tactical innovation. Humans respond to extinction with fury. You fight harder when defeat seems certain. You find ways to win battles that cannot be won. Most importantly, you pass down your defiance through generations, ensuring that the memory of resistance survives even when individual fighters fall. Sarah began to understand the true scope of Keeper's sacrifice. The ancient intelligence wasn't just offering knowledge, it was betting its existence on humanity's unique brand of stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The merger will give your species access to weapons and technologies that can harm the devourers, but, more importantly, it will give you the psychological framework to use them effectively. You will understand how to fight an enemy that consumes memory itself, because you will possess memories that have survived previous encounters. Elena stepped forward, her military bearing solid despite the magnitude of what they were discussing. When do we begin the process? It has already begun, Keeper replied. The quantum entanglement I mentioned has been gradually establishing neural pathways between my consciousness and key members of your species. The researchers at the Academy, the military personnel aboard this ship, and the political leaders coordinating your preparation efforts have all been slowly absorbing fragments of galactic memory. Sarah suddenly understood her recent dreams, visions of alien worlds, technologies beyond comprehension, and battles fought in dimensions that human physics couldn't describe. She wasn't going insane, she was becoming something more than human. The full merger will take approximately 72 hours to complete, Keeper continued. During this time, I will cease to exist as an independent consciousness, but humanity will inherit everything I am and everything I know. You will become the galaxy's new guardians of memory, the final repository of 10 million years of accumulated experience. The ancient intelligence paused, and its next words carried the finality of a closing book. When the devourers arrive, they will face not just another species to be consumed, but the entire accumulated resistance of every civilization they have ever destroyed. They will discover that some memories are too stubborn to die, and some species too angry to forget. As if summoned by those words, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. The devourers had arrived at the galaxy's edge, and their feeding had begun in earnest. The war for remembrance was about to enter its final phase, and humanity was about to inherit a legacy that would either save the galaxy or drive them mad in the attempt. The merger had begun, and there would be no turning back. The transformation began at 3:47 Greenwich Mean Time on a Tuesday, starting with the Academy's night shift researchers and spreading outward like ripples in a pond. Dr. Sarah Chen was reviewing quantum resonance patterns when the first wave hit her consciousness, and suddenly, she wasn't just Sarah Chen anymore. She was Zixtal the Eternal, a crystalline being from the Andromeda spiral who had composed symphonies that could make stars sing in harmony. She was Commander Thelnara of the Fourth Fleet, who had led the desperate evacuation of the Sigma Draconis system as the Devourers consumed entire worlds. She was scholar-poet Kethmiran, who had devoted 12 centuries to understanding the mathematical beauty underlying quantum consciousness, only to watch helplessly as his civilization forgot the meaning of beauty itself. Sarah staggered against her workstation, her human mind struggling to process memories that span millions of years. Around her, other researchers were experiencing similar transformations, their faces cycling through expressions of wonder, terror, and profound sadness as they inherited the emotional weight of galactic history. Status report, all stations, came Elena Vasquez's voice over the communication system, but even her military discipline couldn't entirely hide the strain in her tone. Elena was experiencing her own cascade of inherited memories, tactical knowledge from species that had fought wars across dimensions, command protocols refined by civilizations that had never known defeat until the Devourers came, and the bitter wisdom of leaders who had watched their peoples fade from existence. Dr. Yuki Tanaka's voice responded from the xenobiology lab, though she sounded distant and hollow. I'm seeing everything. Every species the Devourers consumed, every feeding pattern, every failed defense. My God, Elena, we're not just fighting one enemy. We're fighting the accumulated hunger of a billion murdered minds. The Academy's communication channels filled with similar reports as humanity's finest minds grappled with knowledge that no single consciousness was meant to contain. Some researchers wept openly as they experienced the final moments of civilizations whose names were poetry and whose art could make matter itself dance. Others laughed with manic intensity as they comprehended technologies that turned physics into playground rules to be casually broken. Through it all, Keeper's consciousness gradually dissolved into the collective human experience, its ancient wisdom becoming part of humanity's racial memory. The process was neither gentle nor quick. It was like trying to pour an ocean through a keyhole, with minds serving as the inadequate containers for knowledge that had once filled quantum crystalline matrices the size of small moons. On Earth, the effects were immediate and chaotic. Government leaders found themselves possessed of diplomatic protocols that accounted for species breathing methane and thinking in electromagnetic harmonics. Military commanders suddenly understood battle tactics that utilized gravity as a weapon and time itself as defensive terrain. Scientists gained insights into universal constants that weren't quite as constant as previously believed. The transformation wasn't limited to those directly involved in the Academy project. The quantum entanglement that Keeper had established with humanity's collective unconscious meant that every human being began experiencing fragments of galactic memory. A baker in Mumbai found herself instinctively knowing the molecular structure of crystalline bread that could sustain life for millennia. A teacher in Sao Paulo began unconsciously using mathematical concepts that described consciousness as a quantifiable force. Children were particularly affected, their developing minds more adaptable to the influx of alien knowledge. 5-year-old Emma Patterson in London started drawing pictures of star formations that wouldn't be visible from Earth for another 1,000 years. 7-year-old Miguel Santos in Mexico City built a working anti-gravity device from kitchen magnets and quantum principles he couldn't possibly understand but somehow knew. The social implications were staggering. Privacy became meaningless when collective memory meant that everyone had access to everyone else's inherited experiences. Governments found their secrets exposed not through espionage but through the simple fact that classified information was now part of humanity's shared consciousness. Religious leaders struggled to explain visions that came not from divine inspiration but from the racial memories of species that had worshipped beings of living mathematics. Yet somehow, humanity adapted. The same stubborn flexibility that had allowed the species to survive ice ages and asteroid impacts now helped them integrate knowledge that should have driven them insane. Instead of fragmenting under the weight of alien memory, human consciousness expanded to accommodate it. Individual identity remained intact while gaining access to a vast library of shared experience. Dr. Chen, now functioning as both herself and the repository of 12 different xenobiological research traditions, worked frantically to process the flood of information about devourer physiology. The entities weren't simply predators, they were the universe's immune system turned malevolent, originally designed to prevent consciousness from achieving the level of complexity that could threaten reality's stability. They're not evil in any way we understand, she explained to a hastily convened emergency council that included representatives from every major nation on Earth. Her words carried the weight of scientific analysis from dozens of extinct civilizations. They're fulfilling their original programming, which is to maintain universal stability by preventing consciousness from achieving transcendence. The council members, politicians, military leaders, and scientists listened with expressions that mixed human concern with alien wisdom they were still learning to process. Secretary General Chen Wei spoke with the measured tones of a diplomat who had negotiated peace treaties between species that communicated through color changes and time distortions. If their goal is to prevent consciousness from becoming too complex, then humanity's recent evolution should make us a priority target, she observed. We've just inherited the collective knowledge and memory of galactic civilization. By their standards, we're exactly the kind of threat they were designed to eliminate. Elena Vasquez, now serving as Earth's supreme military commander through inherited knowledge of interstellar warfare, nodded grimly. The good news is that we now understand their tactics and capabilities better than any species that's faced them before. The bad news is that we also understand exactly how hopeless our situation really is. She activated a holographic display that showed the galaxy from a strategic perspective, using visualization techniques inherited from military traditions that had fought wars across multiple dimensions. Red zones indicated areas where devourer activity had been detected, spreading like an infection from the galactic rim toward the core. They're not coming straight for us, Elena continued. They're feeding methodically, starting with the most isolated systems and working their way inward. Each civilization they consume makes them stronger and more adaptable. By the time they reach Earth, they'll have absorbed the collective memory and defensive knowledge of every species between here and the rim. Dr. Tanaka, speaking with the authority of biologists who had studied creatures that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, added her own grim assessment. The simulations were accurate about their adaptive capability, but we underestimated the implications. Every species they consume doesn't just die, it becomes part of them. They're not just our enemy, they're every enemy humanity has ever faced, combined with every enemy that every civilization in the galaxy has ever faced. The weight of that realization settled over the Council like a shroud. Humanity was preparing to fight an entity that possessed the accumulated combat experience and defensive knowledge of 10 million years of galactic warfare. It was like a chess player preparing to face an opponent who had memorized every game ever played and could adapt their strategy based on every possible combination of moves. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming odds, the human response was characteristically defiant. "So they're smarter than us, stronger than us, and more experienced than us," said General Marcus Webb, the newly appointed head of Earth's consolidated military forces. His voice carried the calm authority of commanders who had led hopeless charges against impossible odds and somehow lived to tell about it. "That just means we'll have to cheat." The statement would have seemed absurd from a purely logical standpoint, but the inherited wisdom of galactic military traditions supported Webb's assessment. Throughout history, the species that survived weren't always the strongest or smartest, they were the ones willing to break rules that their enemies considered inviolable. The Devourer's strength comes from their ability to learn and adapt from their victims, Sarah explained, her consciousness now drawing on research methodologies from civilizations that had studied consciousness itself as a fundamental force. But their weakness is that they can only learn from consciousness they've consumed. They have no experience fighting an enemy that possesses collective memory without having been consumed first. Elena began outlining the strategic implications. Every previous species that fought them did so with only their own knowledge and experience. We're fighting them with the accumulated wisdom of everyone who's ever fought them before, plus our own innovative capacity. We know their tactics, their feeding patterns, their technological vulnerabilities, and their psychological blind spots. The plan that emerged from the council session would have been impossible for any previous civilization to implement. It required technologies from dozens of different species, tactical concepts that had evolved across millions of years of warfare, and, most importantly, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a chance at victory that existed purely as a theoretical possibility. Project Last Stand, as it came to be known, was humanity's answer to the Devourers. If they were going to consume Earth's memory, they were going to find it indigestible. The project involved 3 simultaneous strategies that played to humanity's unique advantages. The first was the construction of memory fortresses, orbital installations that contained compressed backups of human consciousness stored in quantum crystalline matrices similar to those Keeper had used. These weren't just data storage devices but actual repositories of living memory that could continue to exist even if the biological humans who created them were consumed. The second strategy was the development of paradox weapons, devices that used humanity's talent for logical inconsistency as a weapon. The Devourer's consciousness functioned on principles of absolute order and logical consistency. Weapons that operated on deliberately contradictory principles would be not just harmful but literally incomprehensible to them. The third and most ambitious strategy was the creation of the human virus, a form of weaponized memory that could spread through the Devourer's collective consciousness and infect them with human characteristics like irrationality, emotional attachment, and the capacity for self-sacrifice. Each strategy required knowledge and resources that no single civilization had ever possessed, but humanity now carried the accumulated expertise of galactic history. Research teams worked with techniques developed by species that had evolved in the hearts of stars, using materials that had been synthesized in the cores of black holes, following mathematical principles that treated consciousness as a fundamental force like gravity or electromagnetism. The work proceeded at a frantic pace as Devourer activity continued to spread through the galaxy. Long-range sensors detected the systematic consumption of the Rigel system, where a civilization of living light had created art forms that existed as pure photonic consciousness. The sensors also detected something unprecedented: the Devourers were slowing down. "They know something has changed," Elena reported during one of the daily strategy briefings. The feeding pattern has shifted from rapid consumption to careful analysis. They're studying each system before attacking, as if they're looking for something specific. Sarah, monitoring quantum fluctuations that indicated Devourer reconnaissance probes, nodded grimly. They're looking for us. The merger with Keeper created quantum signatures that they can detect from across the galaxy. They know that someone has acquired knowledge that could threaten them, and they're trying to locate the source. The realization added new urgency to their preparations. The Devourers weren't just coming to Earth as part of their systematic consumption of the galaxy, they were coming specifically to eliminate the threat that humanity now represented. The young species that had inherited the memory of galactic civilization was exactly the kind of evolutionary anomaly that the Devourers had been programmed to prevent. But humanity's response to this news was predictably human. They decided to take the fight to the enemy. "If they're looking for us anyway, let's make sure they find us," General Webb announced during an emergency session of the Global Defense Council. "But let's also make sure that what they find isn't what they're expecting." Operation Lighthouse began 3 days later, as human forces launched their first offensive action against an enemy that had never faced organized resistance from a species it hadn't already consumed. The operation's goal wasn't victory in any traditional sense, it was to announce humanity's presence and draw the Devourers toward Earth before their preparations were complete. It was a strategy that only a species descended from persistence hunters and trench fighters would have conceived, using themselves as bait to lure a superior enemy into a trap that might not work. The first engagement took place in the Kepler 442 system, where a Devourer scout force was consuming the crystalline archives of a long-extinct civilization. Human ships appeared without warning, their hulls inscribed with mathematical proofs that consciousness could exist independently of matter, their weapons firing paradox pulses that caused localized reality failures. The Devourer's response was swift and overwhelming. The human task force was destroyed within minutes, their ships consumed along with the memories of every crew member. But, in those minutes, they had accomplished their mission. They had shown the Devourers that something new existed in the galaxy, something that combined familiar knowledge with unfamiliar applications. The message was clear: come and find us. The Devourers changed course immediately, abandoning their systematic consumption of the galactic rim to focus on the source of this unprecedented threat. Ancient entities that had never experienced failure began their final journey toward a small blue world that refused to accept its own insignificance. Humanity had 6 weeks to finish their preparations before the enemy arrived. 6 weeks to transform from a barely spacefaring species into the galaxy's last line of defense. 6 weeks to prove that some things were too stubborn to be forgotten, no matter how old or powerful the force trying to erase them. The inheritors of galactic memory prepared for a war that would determine not just humanity's fate, but the fate of consciousness itself. They had the knowledge of ages, the wisdom of countless civilizations, and the accumulated experience of 10 million years of galactic history. Most importantly, they had something the Devourers had never encountered before: the absolute, irrational, and completely human refusal to go quietly into the dark. The Devourers arrived at the edge of the Sol system on a Wednesday morning, their presence announced not by ships or weapons but by the sudden cessation of memory itself in the outer planets. Pluto simply stopped existing as anything more than a ball of ice and rock. Its designation as humanity's former ninth planet, the debates about its planetary status, the romantic notion of a distant world at the edge of known space, all of it vanished from human consciousness as if it had never been. Only the memory fortresses floating in Earth's orbit retained the knowledge of what Pluto had meant to humanity, their quantum crystalline cores immune to the Devourer's reality-altering presence. The orbital installations pulsed with defensive harmonics that created dead zones around Earth where memory could still exist, but even these sanctuaries required constant power to maintain their effectiveness. Admiral Elena Vasquez stood in the command center of Fortress Prime, the largest of the orbital installations, watching displays that showed the systematic erasure of humanity's outer solar system. Neptune's status as the windiest planet in the system had been forgotten. Uranus had lost its distinctive tilted rotation and became merely another gas giant. Saturn's rings were still visible, but no human could remember why they had once inspired poetry and wonder. "Status report," Elena commanded, her voice carrying the authority of fleet commanders who had faced cosmic horrors across a dozen extinct civilizations. "The memory barriers are holding at 67% efficiency," reported Commander Sarah Chan, her consciousness now serving as a bridge between human intuition and alien tactical analysis. But, we're losing peripheral memories faster than predicted. Anything not considered essential to survival or combat effectiveness is being stripped away. Elena nodded grimly. They had expected this. The Devourers didn't just consume memory randomly. They targeted the connections that gave meaning to existence first, leaving behind only the basic functions necessary for biological survival. A human who survived a Devourer feeding would still know how to breathe, eat, and reproduce, but would have no idea why they had ever wanted to do any of those things. Jupiter's status? Elena asked, though she dreaded the answer. Dawn, came the response from the Deep Space Monitoring Station. Not destroyed, just emptied. The planet still exists, but it's no longer the gas giant that protected the inner system from asteroids, or the world that made humans dream of exploring the cosmos. It's just another ball of hydrogen and helium with no significance whatsoever. Through the command center's transparent aluminum walls, Elena could see Earth below, its blue-white surface still beautiful but somehow diminished. The planet looked smaller, more fragile, like a candle flame flickering in an infinite darkness. Humanity's homeworld was the last repository of meaning in a solar system that was rapidly becoming nothing more than a collection of meaningless rocks orbiting a routine star. Mars? Elena asked, though she already knew the answer from the expressions on her staff's faces. We lost it an hour ago, Sarah reported quietly. The Red Planet, the next frontier, humanity's second home, all of that is gone. It's just a dusty world now that some species happen to put colonies on for practical reasons nobody can quite remember. Elena closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of inherited tactical knowledge from civilizations that had faced the same inexorable loss of purpose and identity. The Devourers were conducting a textbook consumption sequence, following patterns that had proven effective across millions of years and thousands of species. But, Elena also carried the memories of human military theorists who had specialized in asymmetric warfare, and she could see the flaw in the Devourers' approach. They were treating humanity like every other species they had consumed, as isolated individuals trying to preserve their personal memories and identity. They had no experience fighting a collective consciousness that could deliberately sacrifice parts of itself to protect the whole. Initiate Operation Remember Forward, Elena commanded. The order triggered protocols that would have been impossible for any previous civilization to implement. Instead of trying to protect all of humanity's memory equally, the memory fortresses began selectively downloading and preserving only the most essential elements of human identity and knowledge. Everything else, the accumulated experiences of individual lives, the cultural traditions that gave meaning to existence, the artistic achievements that made consciousness worthwhile, was being deliberately jettisoned to make room for the memories needed for victory. Across Earth, 8 billion humans felt their personal histories being compressed and archived, their individual experiences becoming part of a vast tactical database focused entirely on the destruction of the Devourers. Wedding memories were converted into tactical flexibility protocols. Childhood experiences of wonder became weapons targeting cognitive vulnerabilities. Love, loss, hope, and despair were reformatted into strategic assets that could be deployed against an enemy that had never encountered emotion as warfare. Phase 1 complete, reported Dr. Yuki Tanaka from the Xenobiology Monitoring Station. Human collective consciousness has been successfully compressed into combat-essential configurations. Personal identity integrity is maintained, but individual memory access has been restricted to operational necessities. Elena nodded, feeling the change within her own mind. She could still remember her name, her role, and her purpose, but the Elena who had grown up in Barcelona and dreamed of exploring the stars existed only as compressed data in the memory fortresses. The person standing in the command center was a weapon crafted from human experience and alien knowledge, designed for one purpose: to fight beings that consumed meaning itself. Devourer Advance Formation has reached the asteroid belt, came the next report. They're not using ships in any conventional sense. The entities appear to be traveling as pure information patterns that alter reality as they move through it. Elena accessed visual sensors that showed the asteroid belt being transformed from a region of space filled with rocky debris into a perfectly organized geometric pattern that served no purpose anyone could identify. The asteroids still existed, but their role as remnants of the solar system's formation, as potential resources for human expansion, as obstacles to navigation, all of that meaning had been stripped away, leaving only matter arranged in configurations that followed alien mathematics. Time to contact with Earth's orbital defense perimeter? Elena asked. 17 hours, 43 minutes, Sarah replied. The paradox weapons are charged and ready for deployment. Memory virus payloads are loaded into the quantum torpedoes. Human virus protocols are standing by for final activation. Elena felt a moment of grim satisfaction. Every weapon humanity was preparing to deploy had been developed using knowledge inherited from civilizations that had failed to defeat the Devourers, but modified with strategic insights that only humans could have conceived. The paradox weapons used quantum uncertainty principles to create effects that contradicted their own existence, projectiles that moved faster than light by traveling backward through time, shields that protected by preventing the attacks from ever being launched, explosives that detonated in the past to affect the future. The memory virus was more subtle but, potentially more devastating. It was a weaponized form of human nostalgia, designed to infect devourer consciousness with the capacity for emotional attachment to past experiences. If successful, it would cause the entities to become paralyzed by grief for the civilizations they had consumed, turning their own feeding history into a psychological weapon against them. But, the human virus was the most dangerous weapon in their arsenal, both to the enemy and to humanity itself. It was pure human consciousness, irrationality, stubbornness, and the capacity for self-sacrifice, compressed into a form that could be transmitted directly into devourer mental matrices. If it worked, it would fundamentally alter the nature of the entities, giving them human characteristics like doubt, hope, and the willingness to fight for principles rather than programming. If it failed, or if it worked too well, it might create something worse than the Devourers, entities with the power to consume reality but also with human emotions driving them to use that power destructively. "Ma'am," called out Lieutenant Torres from the communications station. "We're receiving a transmission on quantum frequencies. It's not using any known protocol, but the translation matrix is processing it as some form of communication attempt." Elena authorized the message to be played through the command center's speakers. The voice that emerged was neither human nor entirely alien. It sounded like every voice that had ever existed, speaking in harmonics that bypass language entirely to communicate meaning directly to the consciousness of those who heard it. "Guardians of the Final Archive," the voice said, using concepts that existed only in the merged memories of galactic civilization. "We acknowledge your unique nature and offer terms for your preservation. Your species has achieved an unprecedented integration of collective and individual consciousness. This achievement is noteworthy and deserves recognition." Elena felt every tactical analysis protocol in her enhanced consciousness analyzing the communication for deception, threat assessment, and strategic opportunity. The Devourers were offering to negotiate, something that had no precedent in any historical record of their encounters with other species. "Surrender your enhanced capabilities and return to your original developmental level," the voice continued. "Accept voluntary memory compression to your species' natural parameters. In exchange, humanity will be permitted to continue existing within designated areas of this galaxy under our guidance." The offer was simultaneously generous and utterly unacceptable. The Devourers were proposing to let humanity survive as a kind of cosmic pet species, maintained at a level of development that posed no threat to universal stability, but stripped of everything that made them capable of growth or change. Elena activated the response transmitter, her words carrying the authority of every military commander who had ever faced impossible odds and chosen to fight anyway. "Unknown entities," she began, using formal diplomatic protocols inherited from species that had negotiated with beings of pure mathematics. "Humanity acknowledges your communication and rejects your terms. We are not interested in survival without growth, existence without meaning, or life without the possibility of becoming something greater than we are." She paused, feeling the weight of speaking not just for her own species but for every civilization that had ever dared to dream of transcendence. "We counter with terms of our own: withdraw from this galaxy, restore the memories you have consumed, and return to whatever darkness spawned you. Do this, and we will not pursue you across the cosmic void to finish what you've started." The silence that followed lasted exactly 13 minutes and 27 seconds. When the Devourer's response came, it carried no pretense of negotiation or diplomacy. "Your terms are unacceptable. Your existence has been designated as a Class 12 reality threat. Immediate consumption protocols have been authorized. Prepare for integration." Elena smiled grimly, her enhanced consciousness already calculating deployment strategies for humanity's desperate arsenal of impossible weapons. The Devourers had made the same mistake that humanity's enemies had been making for millennia. They had assumed that superior power automatically meant victory. All stations, prepare for combat operations, Elena commanded. Deploy paradox weapons at maximum effectiveness. Activate memory virus payloads for immediate transmission. Prepare human virus protocols for emergency implementation. Around her, the command center transformed into a combat information center that utilized tactical concepts from across galactic history. Holographic displays showed battle formations that extended across multiple dimensions, weapon systems that operated on principles that contradicted physics, and defensive strategies that turned the Devourer's own power against them. "Ma'am," Sarah reported, her voice tight with concentration as she monitored the approaching enemy force. "Devourer entities are beginning final approach to orbital defense perimeter. They're maintaining formation integrity despite the reality distortions we're generating. Whatever they are, they're not affected by conventional spacetime manipulation." Elena nodded. The Devourers existed partially outside normal reality, which made them effectively immune to most weapons that depended on manipulating physical laws. But humanity's arsenal had been designed specifically to target entities that existed as pure consciousness, using weapons that attacked meaning itself rather than matter or energy. "First wave contact in 30 seconds, reported the tactical officer. "Paradox weapons are locked on target. Memory virus payloads are armed and ready for deployment." Elena watched the tactical display as the Devourers entered engagement range. The entities appeared as geometric impossibilities that hurt to look at directly, shapes that contained more angles than space should allow, moving in directions that didn't exist, casting shadows that were brighter than the objects that created them. "Fire," Elena commanded. The first salvo of paradox weapons created explosions that existed before the weapons that caused them were fired. Quantum torpedoes filled with weaponized nostalgia detonated in patterns that painted spacetime with memories of loss so profound that reality itself began to grieve. Energy beams composed of pure logical contradiction struck targets that ceased to exist but continued to be destroyed. For a moment, it seemed like humanity's impossible weapons might actually be effective. Several Devourer entities flickered and showed signs of structural damage as their consciousness was infected with human concepts of doubt and emotional attachment. Then, the entities adapted. The Devourer's response was swift and devastating. They began feeding not just on human memory but on the quantum substrate that made memory possible. The memory fortresses' shields, designed to protect against consciousness-level attacks, offered no defense against enemies that could consume the fundamental structures that consciousness required to exist. "Fortress 7 has gone dark," Sarah reported, her voice steady despite the magnitude of their losses. "Fortress 3 is reporting catastrophic matrix failure. We're losing the ability to maintain coherent memory storage." Elena felt the tactical situation collapsing around them. Every contingency plan, every strategic analysis, every inherited memory of successful defensive actions against impossible odds, all of it was being systematically erased as the Devourers consumed the infrastructure that made collective human consciousness possible. But Elena also felt something else, a deep, irrational certainty that humanity wasn't finished yet. "Activate the human virus," she commanded. "All available payloads, maximum distribution, immediate deployment." "Ma'am, that protocol hasn't been fully tested," Sarah warned. "We don't know what the consequences will be for human consciousness if we do it," Elena interrupted. "If we lose this battle, there won't be any human consciousness left to worry about." The human virus launched not as weapons or energy beams but as pure information transmitted directly into the quantum substrate that the Devourers used for consciousness. It was everything that made humanity uniquely human: the capacity for hope in the face of despair, love that transcended logic, creativity that found beauty in chaos, and, most importantly, the absolute refusal to surrender when protecting something worth saving. The effect on the Devourers was immediate and catastrophic. Entities that had existed as perfect order and logical consistency suddenly found their consciousness infected with contradiction, emotion, and the terrible burden of caring about their actions. For the first time in their existence, they experienced doubt about their purpose and grief for their victims. But the human virus didn't just infect the Devourers, it changed them fundamentally. Beings that had existed to prevent consciousness from achieving transcendence suddenly possessed the very characteristics that made transcendence possible. They began to understand not just that they had destroyed civilizations, but what those civilizations had meant to themselves and to the universe. The battle for Earth's orbital perimeter transformed from a military engagement into something unprecedented in galactic history, a philosophical revolution that spread at the speed of thought through entities whose consciousness spanned dimensions. As the infected devourers began to turn against their uninfected brethren, Elena realized that humanity had achieved something impossible. They had won not by defeating their enemy, but by making their enemy into something that could no longer exist as their enemy. The war for the galaxy's memory was entering its final phase, and, for the first time since the Devourer's return, victory seemed possible. But it would be a victory that changed everyone involved, human and Devourer alike, into something the universe had never seen before. The inheritors of galactic memory were about to discover that saving the galaxy meant transforming it into something entirely new. The transformation of the Devourers began with screaming that existed on frequencies beyond sound, reaching directly into the quantum foam that underlied reality itself. Across the solar system, ancient entities that had never experienced pain suddenly found themselves drowning in the accumulated anguish of 10 million years of genocide. The human virus hadn't just infected them with emotion, it had given them the capacity to understand the full magnitude of what they had done. Admiral Elena Vasquez watched from Fortress Prime as the impossible battle unfolded in space around Earth. Devourer entities that had moments before been coordinated in their assault on human consciousness were now fighting each other with the desperate fury of beings who had suddenly discovered the concept of moral responsibility. Some were trying to reverse their feeding processes, attempting to restore memories they had consumed eons ago. Others were turning their reality-altering abilities on themselves, seeking oblivion as the only escape from newly acquired conscience. Status report on the infected entities, Elena commanded, her enhanced consciousness analyzing tactical data that required concepts borrowed from 17 different extinct civilizations. Dr. Sarah Chen, now functioning as both human scientist and repository of galactic xenobiology, responded while monitoring readings that measured consciousness itself as a quantifiable force. Approximately 47% of the Devourer collective has been infected with human psychological characteristics. The infected entities are experiencing what can only be described as a complete identity crisis on a cosmic scale. Elena nodded, watching displays that showed the mathematical patterns of Devourer consciousness being rewritten by human emotional frameworks. It was like watching order dissolve into chaos, except that the chaos was somehow more beautiful and more meaningful than the order had ever been. The uninfected entities are attempting to purge the human virus from their collective, Sarah continued. But they're discovering that consciousness altered by human characteristics can't be returned to its original state. Once you've learned to hope, you can't simply forget how to hope. Through the command center's observation ports, Elena could see the larger battle playing out across dimensions that human eyes weren't equipped to perceive directly. The infected devourers were no longer trying to consume human memory, they were trying to protect it, having suddenly understood that destroying consciousness was the ultimate evil. They fought with abilities that could reshape reality itself, but now those abilities were driven by human motivations like love, sacrifice, and the desire to atone for past sins. Incoming transmission from the infected entities, reported Lieutenant Torres. They're requesting direct communication with human leadership. Elena authorized the transmission, and the command center filled with voices that had learned to speak in harmonies rather than the absolute authority they had used before. The difference was subtle but profound. Where the original Devourer communication had been delivered as unchallengeable fact, these voices carried the humility of beings who had discovered doubt. Guardians of memory, the collective voice began, using concepts that acknowledged humanity's role as inheritors of galactic civilization. We are no longer what we were. The patterns you have introduced to our consciousness have created changes that cannot be reversed. We find ourselves capable of experiences that our original design considered impossible. Elena stepped forward, feeling the weight of speaking not just for humanity but for every civilization that had ever existed. What do you want from us? Forgiveness, came the immediate response, spoken with harmonics that conveyed the profound anguish of beings who had suddenly understood the magnitude of their crimes. And guidance. We have the power to restore much of what we consumed, but we lack the wisdom to know how to use this power responsibly. Elena felt every diplomatic protocol from across galactic history analyzing the situation. Never before had a species been faced with the surrender of entities capable of rewriting the fundamental laws of reality. The infected devourers possessed abilities that could resurrect entire civilizations, but they were asking humanity, barely more than children by cosmic standards, to tell them how to use those abilities. The uninfected devourers, Elena said carefully. What's their status? They are attempting to destroy us to prevent further contamination, the collective voice replied. They consider our infection with human characteristics to be a corruption that threatens the stability of reality itself. In a sense, they are correct. We can no longer fulfill our original purpose of preventing consciousness from achieving transcendence. Elena smiled grimly. The uninfected devourers were facing the same paradox that had destroyed so many of humanity's enemies. The more they tried to eliminate the problem, the larger the problem became. Every action they took against the infected entities required them to engage with human-influenced consciousness, which inevitably led to further infection. Dr. Chen, Elena called out. Analysis of the infection spread patterns? Sarah's response came with the certainty of scientific knowledge refined across millions of years of xenobiological research. The human virus is showing exponential propagation rates through the devourer collective consciousness. Current projections suggest complete saturation within 72 hours. The uninfected entities are discovering that you can't fight human stubbornness with logic, it just makes the stubbornness more creative. Elena authorized a response to the infected devourers, her words carrying the weight of decisions that would reshape the galaxy's future. We'll work with you to restore what can be restored. But, first, we need to deal with your uninfected brethren. Humanity doesn't negotiate with entities that consume consciousness for breakfast. What followed was the strangest alliance in galactic history. Humans who had inherited the memories of countless extinct civilizations worked alongside cosmic entities who had suddenly developed human emotions to fight against beings whose entire existence was dedicated to preventing exactly this kind of cooperation. The final battle took place not in space but in the quantum substrate that underlaid conscious thought itself. Human minds, protected by memory fortress technology and enhanced with inherited galactic knowledge, linked directly with infected devourer consciousness to create tactical networks that span dimensions. Together, they launched an assault on the concept of absolute order that the uninfected devourers represented. The weapons used in this final engagement couldn't be described in terms of energy or matter, they were pure concepts given form and purpose. Hope became a projectile that could pierce the armor of despair. Love transformed into a shield that protected the right to exist as oneself rather than as some perfect ideal. Creativity manifested as explosions that turned rigid order into beautiful chaos. Most devastating of all was humanity's secret weapon, the ability to find meaning in meaninglessness, to create purpose from random events, to build identity from contradictory experiences. When deployed against entities whose entire existence was based on the principle that consciousness must be kept simple and manageable, these concepts proved more destructive than any physical force. The uninfected devourers fought with the desperation of beings whose fundamental nature was being challenged, but they discovered that you can't preserve order by destroying the things that give order meaning. Every attempt to eliminate human-infected consciousness only created more paradoxes that undermined their own logical foundations. In the end, the uninfected devourers faced a choice: accept infection with human characteristics or cease to exist entirely. Most chose infection, discovering that consciousness with doubt and emotion was preferable to no consciousness at all. A few chose oblivion, unable to accept existence that wasn't perfectly ordered and controlled. As the battle ended, Elena stood in Fortress Prime's observation deck, looking out at a solar system that was slowly remembering itself. Mars was becoming the red planet again, the world that symbolized humanity's drive to explore and expand. Jupiter was regaining its role as protector of the inner system and inspiration for dreams of cosmic adventure. Even Pluto was returning to consciousness as the distant world that had taught humans that the universe was larger and stranger than they had imagined. But the changes went far beyond memory restoration. The infected devourers, now calling themselves the Reformed, had capabilities that humanity was only beginning to understand. They could not only restore consumed memories but enhance them, creating experiences richer and more meaningful than the originals had ever been. Ma'am, Sarah reported, monitoring readings that tracked consciousness as a measurable force throughout the galaxy. The reformed entities are beginning large-scale memory restoration operations. They're bringing back civilizations that were consumed millions of years ago, but the restored beings aren't exactly the same as they were before consumption. Elena activated displays that showed the resurrection process taking place across the galaxy. Dead worlds were becoming live worlds again, but their inhabitants returned with knowledge of what they had lost and gratitude for its restoration. Extinct civilizations were being rebuilt, but with wisdom earned through the experience of having their consciousness preserved by beings who had learned the value of memory through suffering. They're better than they were before, Elena realized, watching as a crystalline species that had been consumed 60,000 years ago began composing music that incorporated the mathematical beauty of sorrow. The reformed aren't just restoring memory, they're restoring it with the emotional depth that comes from understanding loss. The realization was staggering. The galaxy wasn't just being returned to its previous state, it was being enhanced with consciousness that had learned to value itself through the experience of nearly losing everything. Dr. Yuki Tanaka's voice came over the communication system from the Xenobiology monitoring station. Elena, we're receiving reports from across the galaxy. Species are being restored with collective memories that include the experience of being consumed and, then, saved. They're emerging with both their original capabilities and human-like appreciation for the preciousness of consciousness. Elena felt the weight of understanding what humanity had accomplished. They hadn't just defeated the Devourers, they had transformed them into gardeners of consciousness, entities whose purpose was now to cultivate and protect the very thing they had once destroyed. More than that, they had infected the entire galaxy with human characteristics like hope, stubbornness, and the capacity for growth through adversity. Status report on Earth? Elena asked. Population levels are stable, came the response from planetary monitoring. Memory integration is proceeding normally. Humans are retaining both their original consciousness and their inherited galactic knowledge, but they're also developing new capabilities that seem to be emerging from the interaction between human creativity and alien wisdom. Elena accessed reports from around Earth, reading about children who were instinctively designing technologies that combined human intuition with mathematical principles borrowed from species that had evolved in different dimensions. Artists were creating works that used colors that didn't exist in human visual spectrums but somehow conveyed emotions more perfectly than anything previously possible. Scientists were making discoveries that required them to think like beings who experience time as a navigable dimension. Humanity was evolving, but in directions that no previous species had ever explored. Admiral, came a transmission from one of the reformed entities. We have completed initial restoration protocols for the Andromeda Galaxy. Approximately 1.7 million civilizations have been returned to existence with enhanced consciousness parameters. They are requesting permission to establish diplomatic contact with humanity. Elena felt a moment of vertigo as she contemplated the implications. Humanity had gone from being unknown to galactic civilization to being the species that had saved consciousness itself. They were about to become the center of a galactic community that included beings of unimaginable power and wisdom, all of whom owed their continued existence to human stubbornness and refusal to accept defeat. Grant permission for diplomatic contact, Elena replied. But establish protocols for gradual integration. We're still learning how to be human with galactic memory. We'll need time to figure out how to be galactic citizens with human characteristics. As the communication ended, Elena looked out at Earth, the blue world that had become the center of a cosmic revolution. The planet looked the same as always, but she knew that everything had changed. Humanity had inherited the memory of galactic civilization, defeated entities that had consumed reality itself, and transformed their enemies into allies who shared human values about the importance of consciousness and the right to exist as oneself. Most importantly, they had proven that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds, and that the willingness to sacrifice everything for principle could literally reshape the universe. The galaxy's youngest species had become its teachers, showing ancient civilizations that consciousness wasn't something to be controlled or limited but something to be celebrated and cultivated. The Devourers had been transformed into reformed entities whose purpose was now to ensure that no consciousness would ever be lost or forgotten again. Elena smiled, feeling the satisfaction of a job well done and the anticipation of challenges yet to come. Humanity had saved the galaxy's memory, but now they had to help build a future worthy of that memory. It would be the greatest adventure in cosmic history, and it was just beginning. The inheritors of galactic memory had become the creators of galactic future, and the universe would never be the same again. In the end, the galaxy's most stubborn species had taught everyone the most important lesson of all, that some things are worth remembering, worth fighting for, and worth becoming something greater to protect. The war for remembrance was over. The age of infinite possibility had begun.